Dorian leaned against the cold bus window, watching the blurred scenery of the city morph into stretches of manicured lawns and identical houses. A world that felt foreign yet familiar, all too perfect in its symmetry. His mom had landed a new job, and his uncle had suggested this move to Lincoln Heights, Missouri as a fresh start. But how could a fresh start exist for someone like him in a town like this? The first day at Richmond High was a whirlwind of sideways glances and hushed conversations that died down the moment he walked past. He had expected it. It wasn't his first rodeo as the new kid. Still, each cautious smile from the teachers and their careful tones only confirmed what he sensed. Here was a stranger, an outsider. The teachers were polite, almost excessively so, their smiles stretching a little too tight, their voices a bit too rehearsed. Dorian focused on the lessons, determined to keep his head down at least for the time being. It was in the cafeteria at lunch that the real trial began. Holding his tray, he scanned the bustling cafeteria, searching for a place to sit, but the tables were filled with groups locked in laughter, conversations that didn't include him. A few students shared furtive glances, whispers spreading like rumors. He finally spotted an empty seat at a table where a guy seemed too absorbed in his phone to care about the surrounding drama. As Dorian sat down, a voice cut through the noise. "You lost?" A blond guy leaned back, his smirk exuding arrogance, eyes glinting with something predatory. The laughter from his friends marked their amusement. Dorian inched his fork toward a piece of chicken, not bothering to look up. "Didn't know I needed a map," he replied, keeping his tone flat. The blonde laughed, shaking his head. "Just making sure, not a lot of new faces around here." Dorian met the guy's stare and let silence hang in the air, unflinching. "Guess I'm the exception," he finally said, allowing a small flicker of defiance to shine through. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man," the guy said, still smirking as he leaned back, clearly relishing the interaction. Dorian didn't reply. He just picked up his fork again, intent on tuning him out. But he knew this was just the beginning. At first, it was light japs, whispered comments loudly enough for him to hear in the hallway. "Didn't know they let guys like him in here. Wonder how long he'll last." He chose to ignore it, deciding that he wasn't here to entertain their ignorance. But this was Bryce Tanner, the reigning king of high school. He was the type to hold court with his cronies, drawing power from his family's wealth and reputation, a family that owned half the car dealerships in town. Dorian had come to understand that a guy like Bryce didn't take kindly to competition. Things escalated quickly. The first test came at his locker. As he was swapping out his books, a hard shove sent him crashing into the metal door. Turning sharply, Dorian faced Bryce, who feigned innocence. "Oops. Didn't see you there." Dorian kept his expression neutral as Bryce laughed with his friends. "You're quiet, huh? That's cool. Real cool." After that, a few days blurred together, mediocre attempts to provoke him, including cheap shots and the occasional shove. Dorian always walked past with measured steps, refusing to give them a reaction. If they wanted him to fear them, they'd have to try harder. But then the third confrontation came and everything changed. It was after school, the library quiet as the remaining students trickled out. Dorian didn't feel the urgency to leave. His mom wouldn't be home for hours. Stepping outside, he heard the familiar mocking voices before he could even register the moment. "Hey, new guy." Something hard smacked against his back, a soda cup half full sending a chill of embarrassment and fury through him. He staggered forward, catching himself, his hoodie splattered with its contents. Laughing, Bryce stepped forward again, flanked by his crew. "Damn, my bad," he sneered, tilting his head in fake sympathy. "Didn't see you there." Dorian could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. Sales of the soda were up, but it wasn't for his enjoyment. He glanced at the other students who had paused to watch. Silence fell, tension crackling in the air. "Relax, man, it was a joke," Bryce taunted, but Dorian didn't respond. Instead, he remained still and composed. Bryce leaned closer, mocking. "What, are you scared?" In that moment, Dorian could hear his uncle's words echoing in his mind. "A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas barked." He exhaled through his nose, letting the calm take over. But this was no longer a game. This was a challenge. Dorian took off his backpack, placing it on the ground. Some part of him knew walking away wasn't an option anymore. "Oh, you got something to say now?" Bryce quipped, a glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. Dorian didn't answer. Instead, he rolled his shoulders back, calculating. That small moment of quiet was all he needed. One clean, decisive move. A left feint, then an explosive right hook made contact with Bryce's ribs, the sound of impact ringing through the air, sending shockwaves of surprise through the onlookers. Bryce gasped, his body folding in on itself as he choked on his breath. Dorian didn't stop there. With perfect form he followed up with an uppercut. In an instant, Bryce fell to the ground, his laughter replaced by pained groans. The stunned silence was deafening. Dorian stood back, breath steady. "You done?" he asked, his voice low, challenging. Bryce didn't answer. He just rolled onto his side, clearly rattled. The crowd around them still stared, mouths agape, processing what had just happened. With a casual shrug, Dorian grabbed his backpack and walked away, a sense of liberation washing over him. He didn't know yet that this moment would forever alter the course of his life. He had let a part of himself loose that day, a part that had long been restrained. But the fallout of that encounter was just beginning. The shifting dynamics within the school were set into motion, and Dorian would soon learn that even in victory the fight was far from over. Dorian had walked away from the parking lot feeling oddly liberated, but as he turned the corner to head home, that sense of freedom twisted into something heavier. The echoes of Bryce hitting the pavement rang in his ears, mixed with the startled gasps of the students who witnessed the showdown. He didn't know what to expect the next day, but he sensed one thing for sure. The tide had turned, and so had he. The morning of his second day at Richmond High carried a different energy, one that buzzed with anticipation and a hint of fear. Dorian's arrival at school felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone was waiting for the curtain to rise. Yet, beneath that excitement, a sense of anxiety lurked. He was far from comfortable, and he knew that nothing would remain the same after what had happened. As he walked down the hall, eyes followed him, some curious, others filled with respect, and a few laced with caution. Whispers swirled around him like a storm, pulling in fragments of conversation. "Did you see what he did to Bryce? He's not just a new kid anymore." But not all the voices were positive. Dorian reached his locker, and as he turned the combination dial, the familiar snickering of a few girls caused his gut to tighten. "He's just another violent thug," one of them said, a look of disdain crossing her face. Dorian fought the urge to react, reminding himself of his uncle's words again. He'd been choosing his battles for years. This was merely another form of confrontation. Ignoring their whispers, he shrugged off the comments and headed to his first class. He took a seat at the back, grateful for the temporary reprieve from prying eyes. But even in the quiet confines of the classroom, the tension lingered just below the surface. He couldn't escape the shifting landscape, the way students now whispered instead of laughed, and how some sat up a little straighter in their seats when he walked in. The lesson droned on, and Dorian did his best to focus on the teacher's voice, but his mind inevitably wandered back to Bryce. He replayed the fight in his head, analyzing every punch and the exhilaration that accompanied it. But as the hours passed, he began to question whether that moment of release had been worth the weight it now placed upon him. At lunch, he approached the cafeteria with a guarded heart. The atmosphere felt charged. He was no longer just the new kid. He had become an unpredictable variable. He stood at the entrance, staring into the chaotic sea of lunch tables filled with students who had formed their alliances, gossiping in small clusters. Tension sparked as he stepped into view. Conversations tilted into silence. A few students exchanged looks. Dorian felt the weight of their scrutiny as his heart raced. What would they say today? Would they cheer or jeer? Should he take a seat at the same table or find another? He spotted an open table at the back, a safe haven among all the unpredictable reactions. He made his way over, head held high, but the whispers followed him. The curious glances, wide eyes, and furtive looks filled with apprehension. There were no friendly faces, but there were plenty of eyes that wouldn't buy the narrative they had constructed around him. Just as he settled into his chair, he caught sight of Bryce entering the cafeteria. A collective hush fell over everyone. It was as if a storm was about to unfold. Bryce's swagger had returned, but Dorian noted the subtle tremor in his step. His friends flanked him, but there was a distinct difference in their demeanor. They seemed more like bodyguards than a crew, each of them standing a little farther back than usual. "Look who it is," Bryce's voice rang out as he approached Dorian's table, feigning nonchalance. The remnants of their altercation hung heavy in the air, and a tension crackled between them. Dorian met his gaze, defiance pooling in his stomach. There was no backing down now. "What do you want, Bryce?" he responded coolly, allowing the moment to stretch between them. A smirk flitted across Bryce's face. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. You might be riding high, but you and I both know this isn't over." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Dorian felt the eyes of the cafeteria shift back and forth, capturing the feeling of a standoff. "What do you plan to do about it?" he asked, feeling the pulse of adrenaline course through him. Bryce's smile widened slightly, a bit of malice reflected in his blue eyes. "You'll see." Just know there are consequences for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. With that, he turned on his heel, his posse following closely behind, but not before he threw one last glance over his shoulder, a warning punctuated by a flash of anger. As he walked away, the whispers began again, but they felt different this time. Some students looked impressed, others appeared uneasy. Dorian could feel their energy swirling around him, and yet he was hit with an unsettling realization. The fight he had thought would mark his territory had only opened a door to more complications. Was he now the bully? Would people see him as a violent thug instead of a victim who stood up for himself? Days turned into a week and tension began to mount. Dorian navigated through classes with a face of determination, but inside he felt himself unraveling. Conversations shifted behind his back, judging him for taking a stand when all he really wanted was to be left alone. He was surprised to find himself returning to Coach Harrison's words. They rang true and ached with possibilities. One afternoon, as he finished his workout at the gym, Coach Harrison approached him again with his typical sincerity. "You've become a bit of a legend around here, you know," he said, leaning on the wall beside Dorian. "A legend or a target?" Dorian replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "It felt like a bit of both." "Maybe a little of both, but I see how hard you're pushing yourself," the coach said, crossing his arms. "You've got potential, Dorian. Why not channel it into something more productive?" Dorian considered the suggestion, his thoughts spinning toward the wrestling team. It could be a way to harness his skills and find his footing in this new environment. "Maybe," he replied cautiously. Coach Harrison continued, his tone earnest. "You've already proven you can handle yourself. But real strength lies in knowing when to fight and how to channel that energy into something positive. The wrestling team could give you an outlet, not just to defend yourself but to find out who you really are." Dorian felt a flicker of something, a desire to rise above the mess he had found himself in. "You really think wrestling could help?" he asked, looking up at the coach. "Absolutely. It's not just about strength, it's about strategy and discipline. And more importantly, it's not just about fighting." The coach smiled, an encouraging warmth in his eyes. "It's about building yourself into the person you want to be. The choice is yours." Dorian pondered the idea long after he left the gym that day. Maybe he could shift the narrative, redefine the way people saw him. But could he navigate the treacherous waters of high school while keeping his temper in check? He didn't want to be the villain in someone else's story, or even in his own. As he headed home that evening, a fierce determination grew within him. It was time to pull back the layers and show them there was more to Dorian than the punch he had thrown. The school might have drawn its conclusions, but he had a story yet to tell, one that shifted like the winds of change he could feel gathering. And as every day passed, Dorian realized he had the power to rewrite the ending, to reclaim his story one step at a time. Dorian hesitated at the door of the wrestling room, the scent of sweat and liniment hitting him like a wall. The sounds of grunts, slaps on the mat, and the coach's booming voice made his stomach clench. It was a far cry from the quiet discipline of the boxing gym he knew, a different kind of controlled chaos. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Immediately, eyes turned his way. The wrestlers, a mix of sizes and builds, paused their drills, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Coach Reynolds, a man built like a brick house with a voice to match, walked over, a curious gleam in his eye. "You must be Dorian," he said, extending a hand the size of a baseball glove. "Harrison told me to expect you. Welcome to the Lion's Den." Dorian shook his hand, the man's grip firm but not crushing. "Thanks, coach." "All right, let's see what you got," Reynolds boomed, clapping his hands together. "Everyone back to practice. New guy, get changed and meet me on the mat." The locker room was a cramped, sweaty space filled with the echoes of roughhousing and bravado. As Dorian changed, he could feel the eyes of the other wrestlers on him, sizing him up. A few offered nods of acknowledgement, while others remained pointedly silent. He recognized the same undercurrent of judgment he'd felt since arriving at Richmond. Once on the mat, Reynolds didn't waste any time. "Let's see what you know about wrestling, kid," he said, motioning to a stocky wrestler with a cauliflower ear. "Martinez, show him the ropes. Go easy at first." Martinez grinned, cracking his knuckles. "Sure thing, coach." Easy turned out to be relative. Martinez was relentless, his technique precise and powerful. Dorian found himself on the defensive, struggling to apply the footwork and leverage he knew from boxing to this new arena. He was strong, but wrestling was about more than strength. It was about strategy, endurance, and using your opponent's weight against them. He got pinned. Twice. Then again. Each time, Martinez offered a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of his dominance. Dorian was winded, bruised, and humbled. He'd walked in expecting to be naturally good, to impress them with his fighting skills, but he was quickly learning that wrestling was a different beast entirely. "All right, break it up," Reynolds called out. "Dorian, you got potential, kid, but you got a lot to learn. Wrestling isn't just about throwing punches. It's about control, discipline, and knowing your opponent. You need to learn the fundamentals." The next few weeks were a grueling baptism by fire. Dorian spent hours drilling takedowns, escapes, and pins. He learned about stance, leverage, and the art of reading his opponent's movements. He pushed himself harder than he ever had before, his muscles screaming in protest, his mind battling frustration. The other wrestlers, initially wary, started to warm up to him. They saw his dedication, his willingness to learn, and his ability to take a beating without complaint. They offered tips, advice, and the occasional friendly jab. One evening, after a particularly brutal practice, a wrestler named Ben clapped him on the shoulder. "You're getting there, man," he said, a rare smile on his face. "You got the fire, now you just need to learn how to channel it." Dorian took Ben's words to heart. He started watching wrestling videos, studying the techniques of the greats. He practiced his moves in his bedroom, visualizing each step, each counter, each pin. Slowly, painstakingly, he started to improve. He was still far from being a great wrestler, but he was no longer a complete novice. He could hold his own in practice, and he even managed to score a few takedowns against Martinez. But just as he was starting to feel a sense of accomplishment, a new challenge emerged. Bryce Tanner was back. Dorian saw him in the hallway, flanked by his usual entourage. Bryce's face was still bruised, but his eyes held a cold, calculating glint. He stopped in front of Dorian, blocking his path. Well, look who it is," Bryce sneered. "The tough guy. Heard you joined the wrestling team. Think you're some kind of hero now?" Dorian met Bryce's gaze, his jaw tight. "I'm just trying to move on." "Move on?" Bryce laughed. "You think you can just walk away from what happened? You humiliated me, Dorian. You embarrassed me in front of the whole school. That's not something I'm going to forget." "What do you want, Bryce?" Dorian asked, his voice low. "I want you to pay," Bryce said, his voice laced with venom. "And I'm going to make sure you do." Bryce stepped aside, letting Dorian pass, but the message was clear. The feud was far from over. He had stirred up a hornet's nest, and he knew Bryce wouldn't let it go. As Dorian walked away, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He had hoped that joining the wrestling team would be a way to find peace, to channel his aggression into something positive. But it seemed like his past was determined to follow him, to drag him back into the conflict he was trying to escape. The arena had changed, but the fight was far from over. The air in the Richmond High Gymnasium crackled with anticipation. It was the night of the wrestling team's final match of the season, a pivotal contest against their biggest rivals, Northwood High. The bleachers were packed with students, parents, and faculty, their cheers echoing off the high ceiling. Dorian warmed up backstage, the familiar ritual of stretching and shadow boxing helping to calm his nerves. He wasn't scheduled to compete, being still a newcomer to the team, but the atmosphere was infectious. The stakes were high, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just a wrestling match was hanging in the balance. As the matches progressed, the score remained tight. Each takedown, each pin, was met with deafening roars from the crowd. Tension permeated the room, thick and heavy like the scent of sweat and adrenaline. Dorian watched intently, absorbing the strategy and the grit of his teammates. He felt a growing sense of belonging, a camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared struggle. Then disaster struck. One of Richmond's star wrestlers, a senior named Mark, went down with a knee injury during his match. The crowd gasped and Coach Reynolds rushed to his side. After a brief examination, the coach shook his head grimly. Mark was out. Reynolds turned to the bench, his eyes scanning the remaining wrestlers. He stopped at Dorian, his gaze intense. "Dorian, you're up," he said, his voice barely audible above the din. Dorian froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He wasn't ready. He hadn't expected to compete. But he knew that Richmond needed him. He nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. As he stepped onto the mat, a wave of noise crashed over him. The spotlight felt searing hot, the crowd a blur of faces. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the hope that rested on his shoulders. He glanced at the opposite corner and saw his opponent, Bryce Tanner. A collective hush fell over the gymnasium. Everyone knew the history between them. This wasn't just a wrestling match, it was a personal showdown. The tension was palpable, the air thick with animosity. Bryce smirked, his eyes filled with malice. Looks like our little feud is about to reach its climax, he said, his voice low and menacing. Dorian didn't respond. He focused on his breathing, trying to calm his racing heart. He remembered Coach Harrison's words. Real strength lies in knowing when to fight and how to channel that energy into something positive. He had a choice to make. The referee signaled the start of the match. Bryce charged forward, his movements aggressive and reckless. Dorian sidestepped, using his boxing footwork to evade the attack. He could see the anger burning in Bryce's eyes, the desire to hurt him, to humiliate him. Bryce lunged again, grabbing Dorian's leg and attempting a takedown. Dorian countered, using his strength to maintain his balance. The two grappled, locked in a fierce struggle. He could hear the crowd roaring, their voices urging him on. As they wrestled, Dorian realized something crucial. Bryce wasn't wrestling, he was fighting. He was letting his anger cloud his judgment, leaving him vulnerable. Dorian took advantage of the opening, using Bryce's own momentum against him. With a swift move, he executed a textbook takedown, sending Bryce sprawling to the mat. The crowd erupted. Dorian pinned Bryce's shoulders to the mat, his eyes locked on his opponent's. He could feel the heat of Bryce's rage, the humiliation in his gaze. He had the power to end it, to inflict pain, to finally settle the score. But then he hesitated. He thought about his uncle, about Coach Harrison, about the path he was trying to forge for himself. He didn't want to be Bryce. He didn't want to be defined by anger and violence. Instead, he released the pin. Bryce looked up, confusion etched on his face. He couldn't comprehend why Dorian had let him up. Dorian stepped back, extending a hand to help Bryce to his feet. "It's over, Bryce," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Let it go." For a moment, Bryce stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, grudgingly, he accepted Dorian's hand. As he stood, a flicker of something akin to respect flashed in his eyes. The crowd was stunned into silence. They had expected a brutal showdown, a vicious display of rivalry. Instead, they had witnessed something unexpected, an act of mercy. The referee, still somewhat bewildered, restarted the match. But the dynamic had shifted. The anger had dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet determination. Both wrestlers fought with skill and discipline, each respecting the other's ability. The match went the distance, ending in a narrow victory for Dorian. But the score was almost irrelevant. Something bigger had happened. As the final buzzer sounded, the crowd erupted in cheers. Dorian raised his hand in acknowledgement, a genuine smile on his face. He had won not just a wrestling match but a personal battle. He had overcome his own demons, chosen a different path, and extended a hand of forgiveness. Later in the locker room, Coach Reynolds clapped him on the back. "You showed them what it means to be a true competitor, Dorian," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You made us all proud." Bryce approached Dorian, his expression contrite. "I was wrong," he said, extending his hand. "Thanks for not being like me." Dorian shook his hand, a sense of closure washing over him. He had found a place in this new world, not as a fighter, but as someone who could rise above the conflict and choose a better way. As he walked out of the gymnasium that night, Dorian felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The weight of the past had lifted, replaced by the hope of a brighter future. He had faced his demons and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. He was no longer just the new kid. He was Dorian, the wrestler, the survivor, the one who chose to break the cycle. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Dorian was finally home. He had found his arena, not just in the wrestling mat, but within himself, in the choices he made, in the kind of man he chose to be. And that, he knew, was a battle worth fighting for.